Might just get all the panellists to come on up. So we've got 4 great panellists with us today to talk about, and look, today, how I want to talk about today's session is we're going to do it, I might have a couple questions to throw to them, but generally we're going to get questions from the floor. There's been a lot going on this morning that we've talked about, a lot that's actually been spoken, some disagreements occasionally at Philip's time. So that's what I want to do today. So it's actually questions from the floor that we'll do. But first, let's do some intros of the panellists, and I'll get the panellists to introduce themselves very quickly and where they're from. It's got a range of people who are property, who are managing property, to Philip, to other people like Brad, who are running a really interesting new space. So I might start down the end.
Okay, John McCormack. I'm the Managing Director of Brookfield Multiplex Services. We provide a range of corporate real estate solutions to our clients.
Brad Krauskopf, the founder of Hub Melbourne and Hub Australia. We're the largest co-working community in Australia, and we currently work with over 400 different member organisations and provide them spaces, experiences and connections that drive innovation through collaboration.
Emily Dean, I'm the National Leasing Manager for Telstra. We are the largest corporate occupier of space in Australia, with an annual rent roll of about $500 million. So yeah, manage the portfolio here, and I'm currently on secondment to our New Zealand business, attempting to reinstate our business in Christchurch.
And we know. So thanks everyone, that's really great. Look, one of the things that come up for me with all these conversations and the presentations we've had this morning is, look, that's all really interesting, there's lots of big changes going on, but I keep thinking about the CRE people in the room and going, how the hell do you manage this? And actually, what's our job in the future? So I'm going to throw that over to you guys and what you see, because these spaces that are coming up are very flexible. They include technology, they've got HR issues, they've got everything. So if I can throw that to you guys, you'd like to start, John, want to actually start to think about this question about, so nice, we've got these spaces, but how are we going to actually manage them, and what are the skills that we need from a CRE person in the future?
Well, as a starting point, who is the right person to lead that sort of organisational change? You look at HR or IT, would you necessarily want them leading the process? I think it's a great opportunity for people in property, but to be able to do that, they need to broaden their skills. So there's certainly, and not to be, I say, do you want IT or HR to lead it? It's a bit tongue-in-cheek. Really, people in the property industry need to get a better understanding and have a broader range of skills in all those areas, and be able to work very closely with those other areas to get the right solution.
Yeah.
From a collaborative working environment perspective, if I was to forecast out 10, 20 years, people are not coming to the office to work. They're coming to the office because they need to connect with other people, or the collaboration that we heard of before. So at the Hub, we call them a host, otherwise known as a community manager, a connections catalyst. Their job is there to make sure that when that person comes in, they can connect to the other people, resources and ideas they need to do that particular task, that they actually bothered to actually come to a central point in order to do. So I see that the role there from our point of view is not so much about how do we manage the facility, it's got a lot more with how do we facilitate the connections to other people and to the knowledge flows that they need in order to do their job.
So not only technology, HR, there's also knowledge management. You're going to throw that one in as well. Excellent. So, I mean, it makes it much more complex in one way, but in the other, when you see Philip's presentation, you get to see that in some ways it could be simplified.
I mean, it's interesting. I kind of get the feeling that unless the property world embraces some of this, they'll lose almost all their building management to IT. Because you get IT directors who say, don't hang things off my network. So they don't want some of the sensors and some of the metrics that property want to use on a mainstream core network. And anyway, I mean, IT has now taken over things to do with audio-visual. Printers have become on the network, so they've lost printing. Even vending machines are becoming networked appliances. So facilities management's under threat unless, I think, it adopts what I would call a second network, and that property stroke facilities has its own network in a building to achieve all this. So I see two networks, one for core build business run by IT and one for property.
Now, have we got any questions out there for these lovely panellists?
If there's no
so far?
questions, just following up on that point, I think those two networks may become far more integrated because the way of the future is rather than having all those separate sensors and about space conditions, temperature, CO2, volatile, organic compounds, all that sort of thing, you may be able to get that information on your iPhone and you won't need that second network. It'll all be integrated. So people running property, people will be more aware of what to expect in their space because they'll have the information there. It's not there yet, but the technology is available to do it.
It's as much as the building, and then you've got the usage of the building on top of that, which is what people are looking at as well. So they want to know how well is this piece of property actually being used, and the bits that we've got in here of any use at all, to push what the design is. So that's kind of, in some ways, it's immediate research. That's what we see with our clients. They're looking at how do they get immediate feedback loops for those kinds of things. So the intelligent building piece is an interesting one as well. The other questions, and we talked about this, the city being, we've talked about this previously, Phil, it was the city becoming more responsive and through the whole city, not just the building itself, the whole city becoming more responsive to all the IT and the better technology and the services and getting that, cities getting feedback into that intelligence. How do you see that, from what you've actually spoken, how do you see that affecting the workplace and the city and the building workplace to the city?
It's difficult to know yet because I think so far cities haven't become digital, to the extent they will do. I think the major investment will come from transport infrastructure, and it was interesting that there's a huge exhibition in Barcelona this week called 3GSM. It's the world's biggest mobile congress, and Ford, the founder of Ford, was presenting, and he was basically saying that there's a forecast 4 billion cars worldwide going from 1 billion today, which if that happens, that is obviously gridlock unless we add intelligence into our cities. So they're basically developing things to do with intelligent surfaces on roads, intelligent cars, and a range of things that I think will then lead to an intelligent city. So I think it'll come from transport, not buildings.
Interesting. And I think that real-time information, the question about that is what do you do with it? Because there's as much as having information, but you've got to have the skills and the ability to actually interpret that information and do something with it. So again, that takes another set of skills. So if you're getting all this information from your building, what are you going to do with it? So that goes to that piece.
On the technology side of things there, I think one of the really interesting ones will be the is it geo-tagging, or where your workforce is. As soon as you distribute your workforce over many different locations, having the ability to know where everybody is to enable you to get the job done. An interesting thing about Hub is essentially 90% of our customers are never there at any one point in time. So 90% of the people are actually paying for services, but they're not actually there. So our ability to still maintain a community and provide services beyond just our initial hub, the one hub that we've got in the city, becomes very important. So the technology that will enable us to have distributed workplaces and distributed workforces is going to be essential for that to actually be a trigger to getting to many of the places that we were talking about today.
Have we got any questions out there? Grab a microphone. Just say your name and where you're from and then the question.
Mark Reynolds from Lend-Lease. Just exploring Philip's thin building theme and ask all the panellists, I guess, if you think about that going forward, that potentially that could be a smaller floor plate than the kind of standard 2,000 square metre floor plates that are kind of ended up with boxy buildings. Do you see the evolution of these thin buildings, that the concept of facades or iconic facades that are very different and can be engineered using IT software can create more iconic buildings, and will that add to the diversity of the city, do you think? I guess firstly, do you think there'll be more iconic buildings, and secondly, is that a good or a bad thing?
Thanks.
What are you saying, iconic facades, you're saying? What's... I mean, I think so far we've seen intelligence into facades of buildings, which are more around vibration measurements and humidity and temperature and corrosion and those kind of things, as opposed to the kind of displays. There are a few examples of those as well. But I think the floor plate will change. I mean, we certainly see in Northern Europe, some of those thin buildings are having much smaller floor plates. And you know, the Northern European typology is a much thinner building by physical floor plate than the deep space that we have here in the States and in the UK. Kind of any trends on floors and your portfolio?
Yeah, I mean, don't you have a picture on that one?
One of the other obvious benefits will be less expenditure on the services in a thin building. So you actually have more money to spend on things like smarter facades.
Yeah.
So at the moment, for people who develop these buildings, for most of the occupiers around here, it is a commercial decision. So it's where do you spend that money? At the moment, around 40% of the cost of the building goes into building services. A thin building, by its definition, is starting to reduce a significant amount of that initial capital cost. So you can start to invest that in other areas. And smart facades is certainly one of the areas that certainly our group's looking at.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Can I just quickly make a follow-up on that one? An interesting one that we've noticed with co-working spaces, and this is globally, the effective size of the floor plate is going to be somewhere between 400 and 1,000 metres squared. We call it holding the space. As soon as it gets much bigger than that, it's very difficult for us to hold the space. And if the reason that people are going into their office in the future is to collaborate, then having these smaller plates, smaller floor plates is going to be very important. And we also find it very difficult to hold space over multiple floors. So it's like it's single floor and it's relatively small. That enables us to create effective collaborations. It gets more difficult after
And that, if collaboration is what you want in a space, and that's actually the purpose of the space, that sizing is what you found that actually works.
And that's globally.
And it's interesting because, you know, we're getting quite large floor plates in a lot of the buildings, so it's very different to that, and the purposes will be different. Chris, you had a question.
Chris Power from Power Projects. I'm really interested in the cultural aspect in organisations that accompanies, I guess, the future of work and workplace that we're talking about. And particularly I have a question around what work is being done, what's your experience around evaluation, particularly with regard to engagement of employees and productivity. So we're talking a lot about technology, what's available, and we're looking at the boomers and the millennials. We haven't spent much time on Gen X, which I think are the tricky customers. What are we measuring? I know about building functionality, but what are we measuring in terms of engagement and people?
I think that's a really interesting question, and I think that this stems out of what is the role of the corporate real estate practitioner. And to be honest with you, I think one of the best things that happened to corporate real estate practitioners was the whole GFC. Suddenly we were put into the spotlight, and suddenly, you know, CEOs are looking at accommodation costs and going, right, what can we do about those costs? What value are you delivering to us? So it really gave us an opportunity to be able to put forward new ideas, get the support to be able to challenge what we've got, to work on new ideas. And I think that part of the issue that we still face, though, is around exactly that, around measuring the productivity. And as we move from, and this is the issue that we've got around managing people, is around looking at, it's all now outcomes focused. You know, the notion of being chained to your desk from 9 till 5, it doesn't really matter what you produce as long as you're there, has changed. And I think the notion, and if someone can come up with a way to measure that productivity, is it around, you know, someone sent out more emails for the day, or, you know, we've come up with a new solution. It's so difficult to measure. One of the ways that at Telstra that we've measured it is in our call centres. So we've built a new style call centre, and there it's easier to be able to measure that because it's around call centre time having reduced, the amount of absenteeism has reduced, the amount of churn of staff has reduced, and then there's all the flow-on effects of that. But that's quite easy to measure. But for your standard office employee, how do you measure that? And I think that there's a whole lot of factors that need to go into that. So whether it's environmental, whether it's the sales figures have increased, whether it's around the amount of new ideas that we're getting, and it's something that we need to look at, and I think it's something that will be evolving, and it might not just be around staff engagement and staff feedback, but also to what our customers are thinking about and what they're seeing, and so whether it's a real or a tangible measurement as well, or a perception. Maybe it's around the brand has been profile has been raised in a market. There's so many factors, and I think for each individual business, it depends. So to answer your question, I don't know.
And I mean, that's always been the question, that sort of question around, so it's a kind of so what question. So what, we've got this nice pretty workplace, so what that we've got this nice technology, and so what that, you know, this person's doing this and doing that. Does it actually get us better outcomes for what we're trying to achieve? Does this nice building get us a better one than we had a crappy building down the road? And is it kind of getting us where we want to go? I mean, the example that, Philip, you had was those guys had a really big impact in Microsoft. But they set up their measurements from the beginning about what was success for them. And that's the difference, I think. So then you've got some measurements about how your guys do in your hub space?
So the one thing that we measure at the moment is how many connections do we make for people. I can talk about how many people, 4 or 5 metres for a chair, 1 metre per person overall is what we need in order not 10 metres. But the main thing that we measure, because this is what our business is, it's creating connections for people.
But do you know if the connections actually matter? Does it have do we have an outcome from the connection?
At the moment, we're too young to know. We've only been open for 12 months now.
Yep.
It's a challenge, and it comes back to also the people that are at the hub. They're not our staff, as in this isn't a office where our relationship with them is one of a customer, and 90% of them aren't even there at the same time. And what we also find that with connections, the actual impact of those connections, and this is something that Stephen Johnson will have talked about in his book that you mentioned before, it's the result in 10 years' time, 20 years' time that has come from that connection between unlikely allies or a chance encounter now.
Yeah.
And that's what we're trying to create in these workspaces.
Yeah. Any other questions? I mean, that kind of attribution of what the outcome's going to be to, this lovely space or this new technology, and the attribution of that to the outcomes you're going to get and the successes of the organisation has always been a tricky one, because that attribution is so difficult and can rely on, you could have the same person in the space, 2 different people in the space, same technology, same tool, same thing, different outcomes. So it's always a very difficult one to do. And you get accidents of history. I mean, I had a lovely story a couple of years ago at a university we're doing, and they just happened to have to throw these people in a space together because they were running out of space. And what they found was these researchers who didn't usually have their normal walls and their normal areas started actually talking to each other. And all these new innovations and research things came out of this accident of having to jam them in the same space. But they could track that through the research because it was very specific what a good outcome looks like.
So from a Brookfield perspective, we are trying to define what does a high-performance workspace look like, because there are a lot of different models, but are you getting productivity improvements? And rather than steal the limelight, there is a presentation this afternoon on one of our projects, which is 1 Shelley Street. So I'll talk a little bit more about what measurements have been taken and what is it really a high-performance workspace? I'll leave it to them to present.
Always the conundrum, that productivity. We've got a question in the middle here. Hold on, Kate, we'll get you a microphone. We'll take one swift. All that primary school passing things along helps.
My name's Kate Horton, and I work for an architectural design company in New Zealand, and I lead the workplace strategy piece, so that facilitation and trying to bring some of these threads together, if you like, for clients. So one of the things that I've got a question here, but one of the things that some of the conversations raised is that you and I space in the office at the moment. What we see is that people that are empowered to work out of the office, scattered around, they come back into the office to do their focus time, but they don't touch in with their team. So as a team leader, or as seeing my boss there, I need him and I see him, but he's head down, really absorbed in his world, and it's really frustrating for me. So I kind of wonder what that you-I space will end up being. Also, there are tools, I think, being in development to enable trust, if you like, from a manager perspective, to enable their staff to work from home. And for me, the balance between enabling trust, or that big brother, as it might be seen from the staff member, that's quite an interesting dynamic. But my question for you is, do you actually see new roles being created to facilitate knowledge sharing and enabling leaders or bosses, if you like, to actually spend that time socialising with team to create those bonds?
Anyone?
Yeah, I can talk to that about our host. And it's interesting to see this role is actually emerging in many different companies. At Hub, we first started naming it as a host, naming the person as a host 5 years ago when we first kicked off. And what we end up doing through that person is curating experiences which create connections between people, which then builds the trust. The collaboration doesn't happen without the trust. That's got to come first. So it may well be that one of the reasons that people even come to the office is actually for a weekly lunch, or not a weekly meeting, a weekly lunch, because the whole idea is to build trust between all of those different people within your organisation. They've got the computers, they can go home and do all the work, and they can use telepresencing to meet with people when they're not all in the same room. What they're looking to do when they come into the spaces is to build the trust. So organising reasons for them to come in there where they can connect to other people, to knowledge, to ideas, and just to actually socialise. And yeah, we call it a host. I think you can call it many other different things to fit it in with your organisation. But it's helpful to not look at this as not a reception, and it's not actually even a concierge that is in servitude to you. It's somebody who's actually working to get to know you and create those connections so that you can build the trust. And that will then enable you to have a distributed workforce.
Are people seeing this elsewhere? These
Shell's done a really interesting experiment where they, quite similar, but what they did, they looked at people's own social networks. So they have an internal Shell social network, and they tracked people with the most connections, and they called them the go-to people, which is a similar kind of concept, and they pulled them into a cluster together. So as you walk onto a floor in Shell's new R&D space, you get a cluster of go-to people. So they're the people who know the most in the community, and they know what's going on. So it's kind of like a great kind of place to go for connections and knowledge and a whole range of things. It's been remarkably successful.
But I also assume those people, when they want to get some time alone, they'll not be in that space, because it's a signal when they're in that space you can go to them. So otherwise they'll be pretty busy. Have you got other experiences about this kind of, the whole point about, we're talking about if you're going to come into the office and it's about collaboration, and it's all about collaboration, is about having trust and sharing ideas. Have you seen anything in your businesses which is all about the building of trust, and how do you go about that?
I think it's something that, and I know here at Telstra, it's around us engaging with our partners and using behavioural psychologists and change managers and things like that, because for a lot of people this is going to be and continues to be a huge challenge. The traditional way of managing staff, I sit away in my office and people work out right in front of me, has changed, and it's very difficult, especially for a lot of staff that have been with an organisation for a long time. It's very confronting for them to find this new way of working, and I think the trust is one part, but also too we talk about empowering staff to work from home or work from the local cafe and things like that. But for a lot of managers, that empowerment is also for them is a threat. It's seen to be devaluing I guess, their superiority that they feel that they've earned the right to have. So I think we need to be very careful to make sure that we get it right, and I think it's going to be something that over the next few years will need to evolve and continue to evolve, and I think that's the important part for corporate real estate practitioners as well, is to make sure that we're engaging with the right people to take people on the journey, that we don't just say to them, here's a great new office space that's too difficult for them to use, or they don't understand how to use it, they're not getting the best out of it. So I think it's something that we really need to have a plan and have a journey for, because I think what we're going to have as well is the younger generation are going to come in and take to this new technology like a duck to water, whereas other people it's going to take them a bit longer, and that we run the risk of almost alienating a whole segment of our workforce, and in a lot of instances they're the ones with all the corporate knowledge. So I think it's something that we need to be very mindful of and very careful not to alienate a whole segment of our workforce.
I've only got a couple of minutes, we're going to wrap up. So in terms of that one, I mean, I think in terms of what we're talking about, it kind of goes back to the initial comment we were making, this role of the CRE person. There's a lot more people components to that these days, and a lot more requirement of that. When we talk to CRE brethren and out there, they're bringing on change managers, they're bringing on psychologists, and they're bringing on sociologists a lot more, because what they're dealing with is a lot of that people change. I don't know if you guys have got a last kind of comment on that sort of area, because it is a big thing. As much as you can solve the technology and the building and those kinds of things, it's how the people perform in the space, because what's the point of the space otherwise?
No, I think it's all about people, and it's interesting. Did some work with Telefonica O2 in Europe, and they found a huge increase in presenteeism in this study. And in digging down into that, it seems to be the kind of recession that's driving people to actually be present at work. Yep. For two reasons, not to be kind of forgotten about is the main one, and therefore trust maybe is not quite as good as it should be. So that's driving change.
More anxiety can drive that behaviour. Yeah, absolutely.
In terms of co-working, I think one of the reasons people are looking at co-working at the moment is, we're putting the office into the clouds. Like right now, people are putting their IT infrastructure into the cloud. We're already offering it as essentially a utility. I think that's what could be the trigger with why more people are looking at co-working. But I think the really interesting thing that we're doing at the moment is that we're working out how do we deal with multiple organisations sharing the one space. If we think back to the presentation on digital natives, I think there's a really important difference about people who were Gen Y and Gen Z. It's got to do with Web 1.0 and Web 2.0. At the start, when you had everybody coming into the web, it was one-to-many or one-to-one through our email and what forth. As soon as the Gen Z, who are literally going to have grown up in a socialised world of Facebook, of Twitter, they are many-to-many. And when they're actually out in the workforce, and the majority of the workforce, and these guys are hardwired to be thinking many-to-many, they're going to then demand the workforce to match their many-to-many world that they live in. So the really interesting thing that we're trying to work on at the Hub is how do you manage that space, because it's not just the relationships within your company, but it's also all the relationships outside of your organisation. And that, I know that just made it a whole lot more complex, but I think that will be that next big challenge.
Well, it is the complex, and I think that's the problem. Solving the complex and complicated problems are why you get all these different solutions to things. So, look, I'd like to thank John, Brad, Emily and Philip. It's a short panel, I know, but we've got a lunch kind of coming up, and I'll hand over to Neil to kind of talk about that. But thanks very much for coming on stage and talking about those issues. There's a whole lot of things that we talk about, and I think, as we can see, in one stream it gets really complicated, and there's a lot more going on, but in another it actually gets more simplified. And measuring it is the hard part about it, so whether we do that. So thanks, guys.
Okay, thanks to the panellists there. Interesting, isn't it? We talk about buildings and we talk about technology, but actually it's all about people, really. Always has been, always will be. I think we could do with a session on how to teach managers how to manage, for God's sake. Again, this shouldn't be the science of the rocket. How does it feel to be a manager, and how do you get helped to manage your people more effectively, whether or not they're in or out of a location? So maybe that's a thread that will come up in this afternoon. So good session coming up this afternoon. We're starting to attack some of the case studies. So we'll start to hear from some very, very good examples of how big change has been made. Get the chance to ask some questions about what went right, but also let's hear about what went wrong a little bit this afternoon. Let's see if we can get our honest and open speakers to open the kimono a little bit and let us know what some of the real nitty-gritty challenges are.